Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going deep into the world of central banks. You know, those
hmm
institutions that kind of seem to control the financial universe. Well, get ready because we're about to discover they're even more influential than you might think.
That's right. We're going to be diving deep into Éric Monnet's Balance of Power, Central Banks, and the Fate of Democracies. And he makes the case that central banks have become these incredibly powerful forces kind of quietly shaping not only our economies, but also our democracies.
Okay, so we're talking more than just interest rates and keeping inflation in check. I've always kind of seen them as the financial paramedics, you know? They're always
Mhm.
on call in case the economy starts to go in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you're right, that was their original purpose. Historically, central banks were meant to be these protectors,
Right.
safeguarding currencies and stepping in as a backstop when crises hit.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want the whole system to collapse every time there's a little bump in the market, right?
Exactly. But Mona's point is that their role has really ballooned, especially after World War II. They've become deeply intertwined with the welfare state, kind of implicitly propping up social programs through their monetary policy.
So you're saying that when a central bank decides to print more money after a huge financial crisis, it's not just about stopping a recession, they're also impacting things like, healthcare spending or education budgets.
You hit the nail on the head. It's this very connection that raises concerns about what Monet calls a democratic deficit within central banking.
Wait, democratic deficit? That sounds pretty serious. What exactly does that mean?
Basically, it means there's this gap, this disconnect between the huge amount of power central banks have and how much democratic control we have over what they do. I mean, think about it. They can influence how much your morning coffee costs, they can subtly nudge the job market, and they can even have a hand in the future of social programs. But how much say do everyday people really have in these decisions?
It's true. It's almost like we've put central bankers on this pedestal, assuming they're above the messy world of politics. But as you're describing it, they're right there in the thick of it.
They are. And that realization is at the core of Monet's argument. He's saying that while it's important for central banks to be independent so they can make tough economic decisions, their growing influence on social and political issues means we need more democratic control over them.
Okay, so then how do we find that balance? How do we make sure they have the expertise to do their jobs, but also hold them accountable to the public, especially when their decisions have such a big impact on our everyday lives?
That is the million-dollar question. And Monet cackles this by taking us back to how central banks evolved over time, especially in the years after World War II.
All right, so let's travel back in time a bit to that post-war era. What was happening with central banks back then that's so important to this idea of them having all this power today?
Well, the post-war period was when we saw the rise of welfare states across the developed world. Governments were starting to play a much bigger role in providing social safety nets and putting money into public services.
Yeah, like healthcare, education, infrastructure, all the things you need to build a strong society.
Exactly. And Monet points out that central banks went through a fundamental change during this time to support this new social contract. They shifted from mainly focusing on keeping currencies stable to actively backing the government's wider economic and social goals.
So it became less about making sure your money didn't lose its value, and more about using their power to help governments deliver on those promises of a better future.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting, because this shift often happened indirectly through how central banks managed government debt.
Hold on, government debt. That doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for a better future. You always hear about how irresponsible it is to rack up tons of government debt. It's like sticking future generations with the bill, right?
That's the usual story, isn't it? But Monet challenges that view. He says we need to look at what that debt is actually paying for.
Okay, so what is it paying for then?
In many cases, it's funding those very same social programs. We were just talking about healthcare, education infrastructure. Those are investments in people, in their well-being, in making the economy more productive down the road.
That's an interesting way to look at it. So instead of freaking out about the size of the debt, maybe we should be asking, what are we getting for all this borrowing?
Exactly. And that's where central banks come in. They've got a big part to play in managing this debt, making sure it stays what economists call a safe asset.
Okay, you're gonna have to break that down for me. What makes something a safe asset, and why does it matter so much to central banks?
Okay, picture this. There's been a financial earthquake, and everyone is desperate to hold on to something steady, something that won't lose its value. That's what economists mean by safe assets. Stuff like government bonds that are seen as super reliable, even when the rest of the market is a mess.
Ah, so it's like finding shelter during a storm. You want something solid and secure when everything else is chaotic.
Exactly. And central banks are crucial for maintaining this idea that government debt is a safe haven.
But how do they actually pull that off?
Remember how we talked about central banks being able to create money basically out of thin air?
Yeah, it's always seemed kind of like a magic trick to me.
Right. It's one of the most powerful tools they have. They essentially create this new money by buying up assets, and those are often government bonds. This injection of new money can help keep interest rates low, which makes it cheaper for governments to borrow money and fund all those social programs we were discussing.
Okay. So central banks, government debt, social spending, it all sounds connected, but I still don't quite get how a central bank can just pump trillions of dollars into the system after something like the 2008 financial crisis, and we don't end up with crazy high inflation.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Monnet really digs into that. The key thing to remember is that it's not as simple as more money equals higher prices. It really depends on where all that newly created money goes and how it's actually used.
So break it down for us. Where did all that money go after 2008, and why didn't it send prices through the roof?
Well, after 2008, central banks around the world pumped trillions of dollars into the financial system. But a lot of that money never actually made it into what we call the real economy, where people like us buy groceries and get haircuts.
So where did it all go then?
A big chunk of it ended up in the hands of banks and other financial institutions. Remember we were talking about safe assets? Well, when a crisis hits, these institutions gobble up those safe assets like government bonds, but they'd rather hold on to those than lend that money out or spend it in a way that would push prices up.
So the money got trapped in the financial system instead of flowing into the broader economy and causing inflation.
You got it. And this is another example of how Monnet argues central banks have become even more powerful. They're not just influencing how much borrowing costs, they're actually shaping how money moves through the entire global financial system.
That is pretty mind-blowing when you really think about it. But it also sounds a little bit, dangerous. If so much power is concentrated in these institutions, how can we be sure they're acting in the best interest of everyday people?
That is the billion-dollar question, and it leads us to another really important part of Monnet's argument. This expanding toolkit that central banks have, and why we desperately need more democratic oversight.
Okay, so we've established that central banks are really powerful, maybe even more powerful than most of us realize. They control the flow of money and have a hand in everything from interest rates to what we spend on things like healthcare and education. And now you're saying their toolkit is getting even bigger. I gotta say, that's kind of alarming.
It is something to be concerned about, especially given the lack of, democratic oversight that we've been talking about. And yeah, you're right, their tools are going way beyond just setting interest rates and managing government debt.
So what else are they doing? Give us the inside scoop.
Well, for one thing, central banks are now buying all sorts of different assets, not just government bonds. We're talking corporate debt, and some are even starting to explore the wild world of digital currencies.
Digital currencies, wow. They really are going where no central banker has gone before.
Pretty much. And it's not just what they're buying either. It's about how they're interacting with the whole global financial system. We're seeing central banks doing more international lending, basically acting like global financial diplomats or something.
So they're kind of trying to steer the entire world economy.
In a way, they are.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why Monnet says we need to be asking some tough questions. It's not enough to just ask, can they do this? We need to be asking, should they even be doing this? What are the long-term implications?
All right, so what are the big questions we should be asking?
Well, for starters, are central banks, with their very specific focus on monetary policy, really the best institutions to be tackling these big, complicated, long-term problems like climate change? Monnet makes a good point. Maybe other institutions like public investment banks that can really channel funding into specific sectors would be better equipped for that kind of thing.
So we're not talking about getting rid of central banks altogether, but maybe recognizing that they're not a magic bullet for every economic problem out there.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to Monnet's most important point. We absolutely need to strengthen how democratically legitimate central banks are. And the good news is, he doesn't just leave us with a bunch of warnings. He actually offers some concrete solutions.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does he suggest?
One really interesting idea he has is creating something called a European Credit Council. Imagine a body that's dedicated to providing expert analysis and offering different perspectives on monetary policy directly to elected officials.
So kind of like a watchdog,
Yeah.
keeping an eye on the central bank, making sure they're not just doing whatever they want in secret.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This council wouldn't actually have the power to make decisions itself, but it would help create more transparency and encourage public debate about monetary policy, which, let's be honest, can be a pretty opaque world. It'd be a way to challenge the assumptions central banks make present alternative options and ultimately make sure that their decisions are in line with the values and priorities of the people they're supposed to be serving.
That sounds like a step in the right direction, for sure. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. I started out thinking of central banks as these kind of boring institutions that just set interest rates, but now I see them as this incredibly powerful force at the very center of our economic and political systems.
It's true. They wield a tremendous amount of power, and understanding how they work is essential for anyone who cares about the future of our economy, our society, really the future of democracy itself.
Perfectly said. Well, on that note, I want to encourage everyone listening to check out Balance of Power by Éric Monnet. It's a really thought-provoking book that will make you question everything you thought you knew about how the financial world works. And who knows, it might even inspire you to demand more accountability from these powerful institutions that have such a profound impact on our lives. This has been a fantastic deep dive, and we can't wait to explore more with you on our next episode. Thanks for joining us.